10 years ago, in 2010, I took part in the first academy, and I'm back here 10 years afterwards. But I was promoted anyway in the final round table. Well, last time I took part of the final round table, whereas now I'm the keynote speaker for the introductory section. I would like to ask the interpreters to bear with me because I tend to speak quickly and I only have 20 minutes that were allotted to me, and I'll try to at least include the main topics. Well, we're going to talk about the labor trends and the role of SSE. In order to understand our present and future in the world of work, we should not only consider technological developments, but also a series of phenomena that have an impact on the evolution of the world of work. As Vic was saying, we are faced with a considerable supply surplus in terms of labor supply surplus in the world. I mean, there are many more job seekers than job vacancies, and also the population will increase over the next years, especially in those countries where the labor demand is more limited, and this will have an impact in terms of migration flows. Moreover, all this has led some companies to relocate, to go offshore, and that happens also when their local branches work well because they try to get better efficiencies and relocate in those countries where labor is cheaper. And there is another factor that is important, especially for developed countries. We have some difficulties in terms of the welfare state because there is an increasing demand of services, of benefits, and that applies to developed countries and developing countries. It will be very difficult for the latter to develop systems of welfare systems that are similar to the ones that we had in industrialized countries, because at the time they were closed systems, whereas now we are in a global world. And then, of course, there is the development of the technology, especially digital technologies. And then also we have the possibility, given by new technologies, to produce manufactured items much easier than that. And therefore, there will be a quicker shift towards the tertiary sector without transitioning through the secondary sector. And as Vic was saying when he quoted the figures, we have a very high and a very serious problem of inequality when it comes to income distribution. And this is a problem that is not being faced seriously by any country. These are the trends. And we've already had some effects on the labor market, and these effects are evident. There is a concentration of the growth of employment in the tertiary sector. However, I'm no longer referring to the old tertiary, that is trade and banks, but rather the new tertiary, especially services to people. The capitalistic labor organization is less performing in the sector because there is a very high level of information asymmetry when it comes to the services, and the relationship component is very important. The service provided is based upon the relationship, and the relationship is very important in determining the quality of this product. There is another phenomenon, bizarre phenomenon. Increase of employment in some countries is higher than the increase of GDP. That shows that labor is less paid. And this is evident also when you see macroeconomic data, and you see that the component that is ascribed to labor is decreasing, and it has been decreasing over the last 20 years. There is another phenomenon we are witnessing due to new technologies and services. There is an increasing polarization of the labor market, characterized by a decline in the private sector, especially in the private sector, and stability in the public sector. So there is a divergent evolution of incomes when you compare highly qualified workers and poorly qualified workers. Poorly qualified workers are increasing in number. They have casual, atypical types of work, mini jobs. In Germany, there are 8 million contracts or mini jobs relationship paid 400 euros per month. And informal jobs are increasing everywhere. This is a quite self-telling graph. This is the accumulative change of real weekly wages in the United States. And this holds true also to European countries. You can see what the situation is. For high and medium workers, you've had more or less the same trend until the 80s, and their new liberalism started. Thatcher, Reagan, at that time they launched their new liberalism policies, and from that point onwards there is a very high level of divergency. That is particularly marked for men more than women. Accumulated wages for low-skilled workers continue to diminish, whereas for high-skilled workers you can see the opposite trend, and for intermediate skilled jobs there is a tendency to decline there as well. There was some interference. I thought that there was someone asking questions, but there was an open mic somewhere. What should we expect? What should we predict for the future? Not so much an overall decline of jobs due to technology. There are divergent estimates. There is not a single estimate that tells us what the situation will be in quantitative terms. However, new technologies will destroy intermediate skill jobs. That is, those jobs that had determined the middle class in industrialized countries. That was the class that funded the welfare system. We will have a reduction in intermediate jobs, especially in the manufacturing sector and in parts of the services sector, especially trade and finance. We will see an increase in jobs in those services, caring services for people, and culture. In those two areas, jobs are poorly paid and they're less regular, and there is a predominance of for-profit companies. We will also witness an acceleration between better paid works and less paid or precarious works. Also, in the public sector, there is a tendency towards the decentralization of services. The model of public procurement is taking place everywhere. In all industrialized countries, in all advanced countries, this model is becoming increasingly disseminated. There are tenders that are carried out that diminish the cost of the services. This is something that is being done in all countries, also in Sweden, and that actually completes the circle of outsourcing of public services. The private demand for those services is there, But there are some problems because the price per unit of those services is very high. For instance, caring for the elderly has a very high price. If I buy a car, I can actually use it for a long period of time, and my unit price is not that high. But if I have an elderly person to take care of, the price is up to, well, starting from 2,000 euros, so it's very high. So there is this demand that is shifted towards the informal market that has costs that are lower. How can the SSE oppose this type of criticalities? In general, people tend to believe today that those trends cannot be opposed by taking actions at the public level. But it is increasingly believed that we should opt for something different. The responsibility to face those problems should be held by companies. Today we talk about inequalities, and we talk about an initiative by which companies should actually take charge of increasing balance in income distribution.
Volevo annunciare che è appena arrivato il sottosegretario onorevole Durigon,
Mr. Durigon,
del Ministero del Lavoro,
the Undersecretary of the Labour Ministry, has just arrived.
Adesso al telefono si siederà fra poco qui e poi
We would like to welcome the Vice Minister. Well, this is the backdrop, and companies will have to play a more important role when it comes to social responsibilities, and the role of SSE, cooperatives, associations and foundations, well, the role of them will be more important because these companies are different from for-profit companies. They aim at providing service to people. They do not manage a service in order to make a profit, but they manage services in order to solve problems. Relationships are based on interpersonal contacts. Those companies are managed on a personal basis. I mean, the main characteristic of those social companies is marked by the fact that these are companies of people, and therefore there is a more democratic decision-making system based on one person, one vote. There is a very high level of flexibility when it comes to governance, much more flexibility than capitalistic for-profit companies, especially if we refer to listed companies. Listed companies do not have a flexible governance because they have to guarantee high level for shares. This is not the problem when it comes to social companies. They are much more flexible, and we can see it when they have to weather the crisis. And those companies can also be companies made of a series of companies, especially in the agricultural sector. And this type of business can actually enable farmers to get a fair income from their work. In developing countries, either you organize cooperatives or you have to face the problem of land grabbing. There is no alternative because the commodities market is based upon the buyers. So either you oppose those buyers with very strong tools, or you will not be able to foster community-based farming in those countries. I do not have much time, so I will just draw your attention to some points. Over the last 30 years, even before the crisis, SSE enterprises increased in terms of members and workers and structures, and they've enlarged to many more sectors. In the past, services, caring services for people were not provided by those companies. The Secretary of the International Cooperative Alliances launched an idea according to which, in order to get out of the silence in which those enterprises were kept, it was necessary to focus on those welfare criticalities that the public sector could not manage. After that speech, which is extremely topical even today, social cooperatives started in Italy, and then they extended to other countries. And the SSE reacted to the crisis in many countries much more better than for-profit companies, and they kept employment stable, and not only in labor cooperatives but also in consumption cooperatives. Because the aim of those enterprises is that of responding to needs which do not change during the crisis. In Italy, we have a wealth of data which show that employment was stable in consumption cooperatives, and for 500 million profit, there was a decline. So from 500 million, they actually achieved 150 million only. And new forms of legal organizations started. Let's think about the social cooperatives. They do not exist, and they started to exist over the last few years. It was a bottom-up phenomenon. The community-based cooperatives were also funded. That will be the topic for the next days, and they are reaping very good results not only in Italy but also in the Netherlands or in the UK. And there is another interesting point. The most dynamic forms of enterprises or of SSEs are those that pay more attention to the social outcome of their business. So the ones that are least similar to mainstream companies. And this is very interesting because it shows that since they focus on the social outcome, they probably have a better credibility in their community. Some data at an international level, according to the latest global survey, employees in SSE companies are over 300 million. In Europe only. We have more data about Europe, but that shows that this type of companies have grown also in very advanced countries where the private sector is very important. The SSE organizations employ 15 million workers. There are over 200,000 cooperatives. And here you can see 4.7 million employees. SSE organizations are disseminated all over the countries. 3 million workers in Brazil, in Argentina, and Indonesia, 250 and 500,000 people, and in Italy, more than 2 million workers.
Quale può essere l'attesa? Cosa ci aspettiamo? Quale può essere il contributo, se andiamo un po' più in dettaglio, dell'economia della
scenario to be expected for SSEs when it comes to employment generation. They can play multiple roles. First of all, they are more suitable than mainstream companies to create new jobs in emerging sectors, in particular personal services. and social services,
laddove in particolare c'è bisogno di individuare nuove
where it is necessary to devise new solutions, especially when the users are the ones that propose such solutions. In many cases, SSE enterprises were funded because there was a need that was identified by users, and this holds true to cooperatives in the farming sector, in the banking sectors, etc. They're promoted by users. Users know what they need much better than any other stakeholder, and they can find the most suitable answers. The mechanism is very different from what happens in the for-profit sector, where companies just devise some product that they try and sell on the market. Moreover, they can somehow favor the transition towards formalization because they can work with employees and voluntary workers, and they can actually promote real jobs. They can also work in low productivity sectors because they do not need to make profit. They just have to break even and have the necessary funds for investment, so they can also operate in very high risk sectors when it comes to failure, because there are no investors to account to. So they can also work in those sectors in which they have to keep their prices low, as is the case in the sector of personal services. They can stabilize the jobs better than mainstream companies in general, and especially during downturns. So they actually provide services and alleviate unemployment-related problems thanks to social measures. Moreover, they can guarantee, rather, they allocate value added more extensively. They actually allocate greater value added quotas to workers. And so they somehow can't act against injustices. In some cases, they can actually promote certain jobs, especially in the personal sector, and thanks to new evolutions, legislative evolution in many countries, they can actually reduce employment instability. There are many cooperatives, for instance, that are hiring precarious workers. They build the companies that use those workers, and they guarantee regular wages. Losses and profits are somehow mutualized, and they have shown that they're able to protect workers during crisis, and they can even replace the workers' buyout when they have difficulties, and in the future, if they're used in the best possible way, they will be able to retain workers in those companies when employers want to actually transfer the companies and they do not have children to take it over. There are 4 steps that are necessary. And I would like to draw to a close with this. The first point is theoretical. We as economists as well should stop considering these companies as being the solution for market failures or government failures. Those companies are often considered to exist or to be funded in those sectors in which the for-profit enterprises fail. No, we should stop considering them in this way. We should rather consider social enterprises as a way to organize the business with the same level of efficiency and social effectiveness, or even a higher one, than public or mainstream companies. And not only when they fail, it is a completely different way to produce, which can be applied to all activities and sectors. In some cases, they work better. In some other cases, they work less well. However, the presence of these enterprises in personal services, for instance, instead of public companies, is not to be considered as something less positive, as a second choice. No, this is not the case. The public sector has shown that they cannot provide the right services in the best possible way, and they have been replaced by the social enterprises. They're similar to public enterprises in terms of organization, but they're different because they are private ones. So we should stop considering this sector as a secondary sector that plays a role only as a last resort when other sectors have failed. The second point is regulation. We have regulations that are different in many countries. There is no consistent regulation in any country anyway. So we should really reflect about the need to have new regulations in order to avoid using these companies in an opportunistic way. In 2002 in Italy, we invented the known prevalent mutuality cooperative, as we call it, which is nonsense, because but we did that because we enabled 3 people to be able to open a cooperative. It is considered as being a cooperative, and they can recruit up to 1,000 workers. Is this a cooperative? I would say no. That's why we now have false cooperatives, that is, companies that use this legal form for other purposes. But the problem is due to the fact that the lawmakers made an inadequate law. So we need regulations that protect those companies, and the international experience shows us that when cooperatives are based upon their asset locked, that is, if there is a sale, they cannot distribute the value to partners, and partners are not the ones who've funded the company, the cooperative. Well, this has been helpful for the system in Italy and in Finland. This law exists, and we did not have problems because it is a sort of regulation that protects investments that were made by previous members, by previous cooperative members. We need to have this locking on assets. At the same time, we also need to have more flexibility in organizational and governance terms. We come from an experience with many stakeholders companies, and it's been the case for 100 years. There are emerging social cooperatives that consider the plurality of stakeholders. Voluntary workers and workers and consumers are put together, and it's difficult to accept those forms because this flexibility is not accepted by most regulations in most countries. Do we need any specific support measures for decent job creation by limiting taxes and social contributions to new sectors? Yes, we need that, especially in those sectors in which jobs creation needs low prices. We have a social contribution system which is not balanced when it comes to manufacturing. So when those companies work in sectors that are difficult, they have to be supported and they need to be capitalized. The profit is not the aim, and they work at loss in many cases because they want to keep jobs and production stable. That's why they need some support. Finance, social finance is probably not enough, but we can try, and we have to regulate the public procurement system, especially for those activities that are carried out in collaboration by private, public and social companies. The system that we have at the EU level is not adequate. The last point is the role of the ILO and of international organizations. There are 4 functions for the ILO and the international organizations. They need to promote better knowledge of the sector, its main features and its potential, as well as the relation between these and the objectives of the 2030 program of the United Nations. If we consider the SDG, we can see that the SSE companies can certainly play a role. They should do this by promoting statistical databases. They also need to promote research and studies and conferences and communication activities. Moreover, they should play a role in promoting in general a better knowledge of the sector of the social economy, and the World Bank should play a role. Moreover, the ILO should also try and see what would be the right rules for those SSEs in order to limit opportunistic use and enhance specific features. And the ILO should also encourage dialogue between SSE organizations and public authorities, as well as the trade unions and employers' organizations. There is a great distance between these companies and the trade unions, and this gap should be bridged as soon as possible. Thank you, and I wish you very good